Hello friends, welcome back to my channel. One of the things that I'm terrified about, I'm scared of in this world is making mistakes. I am terrified of mistakes. I'm even scared of even admitting those mistakes when I make them. And this is an unhealthy mindset because a lot of times I've stopped myself from doing the things that I would want to do only because I'm scared that it will end up as a failure. And I don't want a failure. I want to be a success. Now that is a mindset shift, and it's something that I need to learn for myself to understand that failures are not what I make it out to be, like the big thing that I make it out to be in my head. I recently made a video on living life as an experiment, and this was part of that methodology where if I understand that life is an experiment, then failure is part and parcel of life. It will help me to iterate, to improve, to become better. And even the greatest people in the world, people who've done so well, Jeff Bezos, Steve Jobs, all of these other people Elon Musk, they've all had failures in their lives to be able to come to success. It doesn't come overnight. It doesn't come on a golden platter. They had to work hard. They had to fail, and then they eventually succeeded. Now, to help me in this journey of understanding what failure is and how I can embrace failure as a positive mindset, I read a great book by Mathew Syed. Mathew Syed has also written another book called Bounce, but the book I'm in question that I'm talking about is called Black Box Thinking. This is the book, Black Box Thinking. Now, from the title, Black Box. So a black box is basically a box within a plane, an aircraft, which is there in the cockpit, I think, and in the back of the plane as well. When an aircraft crashes, the black box records conversations and records data that people can find useful to know why a certain crash happens. For example, the Malaysian Airlines MH370 that crashed many years ago. That is still a dilemma on what actually happened. But the whole point of it, when the crash happens, people who do these investigations go and find the black box. It's actually, I think it's an orange box, just so it stands out, but it's still being called a black box. I'm not really sure why. But what the black box does is it tells them why the failure happened, why the plane crashed and killed so many people, so that further down the line, this mistake will not happen. And the aviation industry is fantastic about this whole failure mindset, and Matthew goes into a lot of detail about stories where in the aviation industry they learn from the mistakes. So whenever a plane crash happens, whenever something happens, they look at the black box, they speak to the pilots, they investigate it, and they do a good job about it to make sure that planes don't crash. And in fact, air travel is one of the safest forms of travel currently in this world at the moment. And the reason is because of black box thinking. Now, Matthew starts off with a great story. So this is a story about a British woman called Elaine. And Elaine was going to the hospital under the NHS in the UK for a routine operation. It was something to do with a sinus operation or something like that. And it was a routine operation. Nothing out of the ordinary. But what happened was complications happened during that process, and one thing led to the other, which eventually led to Elaine dying out of that routine operation. Nothing should have gone wrong, but everything that could have gone wrong went wrong. Now that is fine because mistakes happen I mean, like the whole point of a doctor, the whole job of a doctor is to make sure that he tries his best to save a life. If mistakes happen, then you learn from your mistakes. But the problem with this story that he explains in the book is that the aftermath of what happened was the doctors tried to hide the story, tried to hide what exactly happened, because obviously due to their ego, they don't want to admit what has happened. And as a result, they told Martin, who was the partner of Elaine, that it just didn't go, the operation didn't go well, and there was a complication and things happened. But the mistakes were not brought to the forefront. So Martin then went into an investigation to investigate exactly what happened, and it was found that it was actually failures, that the doctors were not listening to the nurses. The nurses were scared to speak up because the doctors were the authorities. And this is a whole mindset shift that he's talking about, that the only way you learn about all these things, about all these things, is if you embrace failure and if you learn why you failed, so you can prevent things happening in the future. Because of Martin's story and Elaine's story, a lot of deaths have been prevented from the story. A lot of deaths have been prevented because people learned from that mistake. But if Martin had not gone ahead and carried out an investigation, that would have been put on the back burner, and we wouldn't have learned from these mistakes. And the whole point of this book is to tell us that failures are good for us. They are there to help us to iterate, to improve, to become better, because 1,000 failures means 1,000 steps closer to the success that I'm looking for. Now, the book goes into a lot of detail, and the reason I love the book is he has a lot of stories in the book. Stories that we can relate to, we can understand, that keep us engaged. And I learned a lot from this book. I think this is probably one of the best books that I've read on failures. He's got a topic called cognitive dissonance. Now, cognitive dissonance is an interesting psychology, interesting framework where what happens is a person who has cognitive dissonance, they have conflicting worldviews, conflicting viewpoints, and in their minds, that is fine, it's justified. Let me give you an example. So this is an example he talks about in the book as well. So let's look at Tony Blair and the Iraq War of 2003. So all through Parliament, Tony Blair was saying that when he was the Labour president, the Labour Prime Minister from 1997 onwards, he was telling Parliament that Iraq has weapons of mass destruction, and we are sure of it. And then as time went on, the investigation couldn't find it. So he changed his story and said Iraq has weapons of mass destruction, but they've hidden it and we can't find it, but they still have it. And then as investigations went on, it was found that there were no weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. So what does Tony Blair say? He says Iraq does not have weapons of mass destruction, but we are justified to have gone into Iraq because of Saddam Hussein and the dictatorship and all of these things that justify why America and the UK had basically gone into Iraq and overthrown Saddam. Now, that's cognitive dissonance. Like in his mind, he basically had two conflicting views. One was that we went into Iraq because there were weapons of mass destruction, and the other one was, even though there were no weapons of mass destruction, we still went into Iraq. The two conflicting views. But in his mind, it made sense because the goal was to go into Iraq in the first place, which is obviously not what he said in the beginning. But weapons of mass destruction was used as a justification to enter into Iraq. Now, when it comes to cognitive dissonance, even in our personal lives, we do this as well. We justify the ends using the means sometimes, and we also create conflicting means in our heads. So we think of something and say we're doing this because of this, and then when it is found that the thing that we're thinking of is wrong, we change it and say we're still doing it, but because of something else. We might be conflicting to the first reason, but we're still going to do it because there is evidence that we have to do it. Of course, because we've started it and we're still like going ahead with it, and it would be bad, it would be a failure for us to now say actually we were wrong. That's the problem. We find it very hard to admit our mistakes. That is one of the biggest problems. And the other problem that Matthew talks about is in part 5 of the book. He calls it if you look here, this is the contents. It's called the blame game. And that is something that happens a lot in the corporate world. It happens a lot in the medical world as well, where you blame people for the mistakes they make. And of course, if you do that, people will find it hard to come forward. In the aviation world, for example, there is no blame game to an in-depth sense like in other industries, because the whole point of black box thinking is, with the black box, you just learn from your mistakes. Yes, mistakes have happened. Yes, someone did the mistake. Of course, someone did the mistake. But it's not about blaming someone. It's more about learning what could have been done better so that next time we can improve, iterate, we can become better to make sure the crash doesn't happen. But this doesn't happen in other spheres of the world. In the corporate world, for example, if someone makes a mistake, their bosses will blame the person who makes a mistake. Not why did the mistake happen? Maybe there was a protocol that was not followed. Maybe the instructions weren't as clear. Maybe there's something underlying that caused that mistake to happen. None of that. It's all about the blame game, and that's why we have so many failures in in other aspects, because we blame people a lot. But I think the most important mindset and the most important lesson I took away from this book is the last chapter that he calls creating a growth culture. The whole point of a growth culture and a growth mindset is like what aviation has done, that failures are there to help us improve for the future. They are there to help us make our lives better. We have to fail because the only way to succeed is to go through all these failures, because through a failure we become better. So let me read a certain portion that Matthew talks about in this whole concept of creating a growth culture. He says, but when you regard failure as a learning opportunity, when you trust in the power of practice to help you grow through difficulties, your motivation and self belief are not threatened in anything like the same way. Indeed, you embrace failure as an opportunity to learn, whether about improving a vacuum cleaner, creating a new scientific theory, or developing a promising football career. And he refers to David Beckham here, where he's got a whole story about Beckham's failures in his career as well. But this is the growth mindset, where you realize that actually we need failures in life. We need to be able to fail so that we can improve, we can become better, we can do well. He even says in another part of the book, he says, learn from the mistakes of others. You can't live long enough to make them all yourself. So again, not just our mistakes. We learn from other people who've made mistakes in their lives, and that's why reading books are really good, because in books we see what mistakes people made, and then we improve and iterate based on those mistakes, and we know what what should be done differently. Elsewhere, let me read another paragraph. He says, we should praise each other for trying, for experimenting, for demonstrating resilience and resolve, for daring to learn through our critical investigations, and for having the intellectual courage to see evidence for what it is rather than what we want it to be. Again, all about cognitive dissonance. If going into Iraq because of weapons of mass destruction was wrong, then you admit that it is wrong. But obviously Tony Blair cannot admit that, because his whole career was based on him going into Iraq. So this puts a big spanner in the works, and that's what we as individuals as well, we are scared to admit our failures, because we would look low in front of other people. We'd look like we've not done well. He continues saying, if we only ever praise each other for having things right, for perfection, for flawlessness, we will insinuate, if only unintentionally, that it is possible to succeed without failing. And that's false. We cannot succeed without failing, because no one's born with a manual. He says, to climb without failing. In a world that is complex, whose beauty is revealed in its intricacy and depth, this is misconceived. We have to challenge this misconception in our lives and in our organizations. To do so would be nothing less than revolutionary. A liberating attitude to error would change almost every aspect of our professions, schools, and political institutions. It would not be easy. There will doubtless be resistance, but the battle is worth it. Indeed, instead of shying away from criticism and inconvenient evidence, we should embrace them. I think that's such a powerful paragraph, because essentially what he's saying is we should embrace failure, because failure is meant to help us improve. It's every failure we take, every failure we undergo is getting us closer to the success we're looking for. And one of the other things that I learned from the book is that I shouldn't be scared of failure, because my one of my biggest problems is I didn't end up doing things because I was scared of failing, because I did not want to be labeled as a failure. But as I said in a previous video, that if life is an experiment, and this is all an experiment, it's no longer a failure as big a thing in my head as I've made it. Failure is just a changed hypothesis, a changed chemical, something changed within the experiment. All you're doing is, if two chemicals don't work, you use another two chemicals. If the hypothesis is wrong, you change the hypothesis. But it's not a big deal. It's all about going towards a success and going towards learning from your mistakes to be able to become better, improve, iterate, and become the best version of yourself, and do things in this world that are amazing, that even you are surprised to have done. So that when God meets you, when you meet God, and when you return back to him, you can proudly say, you know what, I did what I could. Even though I failed, I know I tried my best, and I'm proud to offer you the best that I could offer in this world. And I think that would have been a life that is worth living, and worth lived for. So I hope you take away some useful lessons about failure and success, and that failure is not this big thing that we've made up in our heads. And I hope I do encourage you to read this book. It's a fantastic book. Like I said, it's one of the best books I've read on failure, and the path to failure and the path to success. It's changed my thinking. The whole black box thinking has changed my approach and thinking to failure. I now embrace failure. I now understand that it's part and parcel of my life, and I'm happy that when I fail, I know that I've actually done something to warrant the failure. Because if I hadn't failed and I hadn't done the thing, then that is in a worse situation than doing something and failing at it. So yes, I hope I encourage you to read the book. Please do read it, and if you do read it and you enjoy it, please let me know in the comments. Until next time, see you soon.